In 1898, a broke, jobless man borrowed $3,500 from his brother-in-law, bought an abandoned factory, and started making poker chips and horseshoe pads. 73 years later, his company's tires were rolling across the surface of the moon. Somewhere in between, this company nearly ceased to exist. 3 times. Goodyear, one of the most recognized brands in American history, has been on the brink of total collapse. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. And each crisis was brought on by a completely different force: reckless expansion, a corporate raider, and a mountain of debt that almost buried the company for good. Today, we are going to trace the full arc of Goodyear's 127-year history, from a borrowed down payment on an abandoned factory to a global empire with 74,000 employees and every near-death experience in between. Let us start at the beginning, because the founding story of Goodyear tells you everything you need to know about the DNA of this company. It is 1898. Frank Seiberling is 38 years old, jobless, with a wife and 3 children. His father's street railway company had collapsed in the financial panics of the 1890s. The family fortune was gone. Frank had no capital, no factory, and no clear plan for what to do next. Then he learned that an old strawboard factory in East Akron, Ohio was available. 7 acres of land, an empty building, sitting there waiting for someone desperate enough to take a chance on it. The price was $13,500. Frank Seiberling did not have it. So he borrowed $3,500 from his brother-in-law, Lucius Miles, scraped together a down payment, and bought the place. On August 29, 1898, Goodyear was officially incorporated with a capital stock of $100,000. Frank named the company after Charles Goodyear, the man who discovered the vulcanization process for rubber. Charles Goodyear had died penniless nearly 40 years earlier. It was an odd choice for a namesake, naming your company after a man who never made a dime from his own invention. But Frank Seiberling was not superstitious. He was desperate. With just 13 employees, Goodyear began production on November 21, 1898. The product line included bicycle tires, carriage tires, horseshoe pads, and poker chips, not exactly the stuff of industrial legend. But Frank Seiberling, who would come to be known as the Little Napoleon of the rubber industry because of his small stature and relentless determination, had a vision that extended far beyond poker chips. He saw what was coming. The automobile was about to change everything, and whoever could make tires fast, cheap, and reliable would own the market. Frank designed tires and rims that could be attached easily to any car. It was a simple innovation, but it was the right innovation at the right time. By 1916, just 18 years after 13 workers started making horseshoe pads in an old strawboard factory, Goodyear was the largest tire producer in the world. The rubber capital of the world, as Akron would come to be known, was built on innovations like these. Think about that trajectory. 18 years from borrowed money and poker chips to global dominance. It is one of the most remarkable ascents in American business history. And then it almost ended. The First World War had been enormously profitable for Goodyear. Government contracts poured in. Sales jumped from $110 million in 1916 and 1917 to $172 million by 1918 and 1919. By 1920, sales hit $223 million. Frank Seiberling was building an empire, and he was spending like it would never stop growing. But the war ended. Government contracts were canceled overnight. The economy lurched into a sharp recession, and Goodyear, which had expanded aggressively on the assumption that the good times would roll forever, was suddenly drowning. By 1921, sales had collapsed to $105 million, less than half of their peak, with a $5 million loss on top of it. The book value of Goodyear's common stock, which had stood at $75 million in early 1920, was reduced to 0, not diminished, not halved. 0. The company's equity was completely wiped out. Bankruptcy was imminent. The world's largest tire maker was about to disappear. In desperation, Goodyear accepted temporary refinancing of $18 million from a banking syndicate led by Goldman Sachs and A.G. Becker of Chicago. But the bankers did not come with just money, they came with conditions. The company would be refinanced, and it would be reorganized. Dillon Read and Company oversaw the restructuring. Frank Seiberling, the man who had borrowed $3,500 from his brother-in-law and built the whole thing from nothing, was forced out of his own company. His brother Charles Seiberling went with him. It is one of the cruelest ironies in American business. The founder saves the company from non-existence, builds it into the biggest in the world, and then gets pushed out the door when his own ambition outpaces reality. Frank Seiberling did not disappear. He went on to incorporate the Seiberling Rubber Company, which would eventually be acquired by, of all companies, Firestone. Goodyear's rival. You cannot make this stuff up. With new leadership in place, Goodyear stabilized. Paul Litchfield, who had been granted a patent on the first tubeless automobile tire back in 1903, was one of the few original officers who survived the reorganization. Under new management, Goodyear rebuilt itself through the Roaring '20s, survived the Great Depression, and by 1935 strategically acquired Kelly Springfield Tire Company to strengthen its market position. The company became a cornerstone of the American industrial establishment for the next 60 years. By the mid-1980s, Goodyear was the 35th largest company in the United States. It had diversified well beyond tires into aerospace, energy, and various industrial products. It was the kind of rock-solid Midwestern company that would never be associated with possible defaults on its financial obligations. But there was a problem hiding behind all that apparent stability. Though the diversification had pushed Goodyear to $10 billion in sales, from 1982 to 1986, its shares had dropped in value by 20%. During that same period, the broader stock market had risen 230%. Part of the challenge was competitive pressure. Companies like Michelin had revolutionized the industry with radial tire technology, forcing American manufacturers to play catch-up. The management was complacent, the board was comfortable, and the share price was stagnant. In the world of corporate finance in the 1980s, that combination was blood in the water. On September 25th, 1986, a British-French financier named Sir James Goldsmith began quietly accumulating Goodyear stock through his General Oriental Limited Partnerships. By October 31st, he announced he held 11.5% of the company. Then came the offer, $5.3 billion to buy Goodyear outright. Now, this was the era of the corporate raider, Gordon Gekko from the movie Wall Street, leveraged buyouts, hostile takeovers, and Goldsmith was one of the most feared operators in the game. He believed, and many financial experts agreed, that corporate raiders served a useful purpose. They kept management honest, forced efficiency, and unlocked shareholder value. His argument was simple. Goodyear's management had been asleep at the wheel, and he was here to wake them up. But in Akron, Ohio, Goldsmith wasn't seen as a liberator. He was seen as a destroyer. The community response was extraordinary. At Cuyahoga Falls High School, students set up a darts game in the hallway outside the cafeteria. The target was a cartoon of Sir James Goldsmith inside a Goodyear tire. They raised $200 in 2 days to buy Goodyear stock. The student group called SMART, which stood for Students March Against Raider Takeovers. That's how deeply Goodyear was woven into the fabric of this community. This wasn't just a stock ticker symbol. This was tens of thousands of jobs, generations of families, an entire regional identity. Goodyear's chairman, Robert Mercer, led the fight to repel the takeover. And in a moment that captured the desperation of the battle, Mercer made one of the most memorable statements in corporate defense history. "What we think we're going to do is stop short of suicide." That line tells you everything. They were willing to do almost anything to save the company. Almost. On November 20th, 1986, Goodyear bought back all of Goldsmith's shares at $49.50 per share. The raider walked away, but the cost of victory was staggering. Goldsmith's profit from the whole affair was $94 million. The Akron Beacon-Journal calculated that those profits came to $1,044 per minute for 2 months of work. Let that sink in. Over $1,000 a minute, every minute, for 60 days. And Goodyear, in buying Goldsmith shares, The company had also committed to repurchasing an additional 40 million shares at $50 each. The total debt load soared above $2 billion. To service that debt, Goodyear had to sell off pieces of itself. In 1987, Goodyear Aerospace was sold to the Laurel Corporation. The diversified empire that management had spent years building was dismantled in a matter of months. Not because the strategy was wrong, but because they had to pay the ransom to keep the raiders away. Mercer was blunt about the aftermath. He said he hasn't helped Goodyear at all, in one way or in any way. We had our broad-based approach to business for solid reasons. Now, we have had to narrow that base. The company survived, but it emerged from the Goldsmith battle wounded, leveraged, and strategically diminished. It would take years to recover, and when it did, the third and most dangerous crisis was already brewing. By the late 1990s and the early 2000s, the tire industry was being reshaped by global competition. Bridgestone had acquired Firestone. Michelin was aggressively expanding. Continental AG was strengthening its position as the fourth largest tire manufacturer globally, and Goodyear, still carrying scars from the Goldsmith era, was struggling to keep pace. Under CEO Samir Gabara, who led the company from 1996 to 2003, Goodyear's financial position deteriorated dramatically. The numbers tell a brutal story. In 2002, Goodyear reported a net loss of $1.01 billion. That's $6.62 per share, compared with a loss of $203.06 million the previous year. Sales fell 2.1% to $13.09 billion. 20,000 Goodyear workers had lost their jobs over the preceding 6 years. Early in 2003, Goodyear shares fell below $4. That was the lowest level in at least 4 decades. The company was staring down a liquidity crisis that threatened outright bankruptcy. This was not a hostile raider or a post-war recession. This was the slow, grinding erosion of a company that had lost its competitive edge. When Gabara resigned in May 2003, his parting words were quietly devastating. There is no question that I am disappointed with the recent performance of the company. The man brought in to save Goodyear was Robert Keegan. He had joined as president and chief operating officer in October 2000 after spending 28 years at Eastman Kodak. On January 1, 2003, Keegan was elected chief executive officer. By July, he added the chairmanship. Keegan understood that half measures would not work. His assessment was clear and public. 2003 must be a transformational year for Goodyear, and critical steps will be required to get us back on track. We must improve our cost structure, simplify our business processes, and operate more efficiently. In April 2003, Keegan pulled off the most critical move. He restructured $2.09 billion in bank debt and stretched out the payments. That single transaction bought Goodyear the time it needed to survive. Without it, bankruptcy was weeks away, maybe days. Then came the harder part. In September 2003, the United Steelworkers ratified a new contract that slashed labor costs by $1.15 billion over 3 years and cut 3,000 jobs. That negotiation was agonizing for everyone involved, but it kept the doors open. Keegan later reflected on what crisis does to a company. In 2009, he said something that should be framed on the wall of every executive office in America. I'll admit that one significant exception occurs if your company is fighting for its survival. No matter what kind of behavior your culture supports, if you have to change to survive, you will change. You will innovate. Goodyear changed. Goodyear innovated. The company pioneered flat tire technology in 1992 and continued pushing innovation throughout this period. Goodyear survived its third near-death experience under Keegan and then Richard Kramer, who took over as chief executive officer in 2010 and would serve for 14 years. The company stabilized and grew. In 2021, Goodyear made its biggest strategic move in decades, acquiring Cooper Tire and Rubber Company in a deal with a total enterprise value of approximately $2.5 billion. The combined company would have approximately $17.05 billion in pro forma sales. with expected cost synergies of $165 million within 2 years. But history has a way of rhyming at Goodyear. In May 2023, activist investor Elliott Investment Management sent an open letter to Goodyear's board that sent shockwaves through the company. Elliott argued it had deep conviction in the opportunity for Goodyear to improve after more than a decade of underperformance. The firm accused Goodyear of falling behind rivals like Michelin and Bridgestone amid weak overall management. The parallels to 1986 were impossible to ignore. Once again, an outside force was telling Goodyear that its management was not good enough. But this time, instead of fighting, Goodyear listened. In November 2023, the company announced the Goodyear Forward Transformation Plan, targeting $1 billion in annual run rate cost reductions by the end of 2025 and aiming to double segment operating income margins from roughly 5% to 10%. Richard Kramer acknowledged the challenge directly. He said the transformation plan represents a clear path to create a more profitable and focused Goodyear. Then, in January 2024, Kramer retired after 24 years of service. His successor, Mark Stewart, came from Stellantis, where he had served as Chief Operating Officer of North America. Stewart said he was honored and humbled to join Goodyear at such a pivotal time in its history. Under Stewart, Goodyear has been aggressively reshaping its portfolio. In July 2024, the off-the-road tire business was sold to Yokohama Rubber Company for $905 million. In January 2025, the iconic Dunlop brand was sold to Sumitomo Rubber Industries, with gross proceeds of $735 million. These are not small moves. These are the kind of decisions that redefine what a company is and what it wants to be. Stewart has acknowledged that Goodyear is in what he calls a show me period with investors. The company has reported 5 consecutive quarters of margin growth and its best retail performance in more than 20 years, but shares are still down more than 30% since the transformation plan was announced. The market is watching. The market is waiting. So here's where we are. Goodyear, a company founded with borrowed money and poker chips in 1898, has survived the loss of its founder, a stock value of 0, a corporate raider who walked away with $94 million, a $1.01 annual loss, and repeated existential crises that would have killed most companies several times over. In 1971, American astronauts on the Apollo 14 mission hauled moon rocks across the lunar surface in a modular equipment transporter with Goodyear tires. Think about that. A company that started in an abandoned strawboard factory put its tires on the moon. And then it nearly went bankrupt twice more after that. The Goodyear story isn't a story about tires. It's a story about what happens when a company refuses to die. 3 existential crises, 3 different decades, 3 completely different threats, and each time, someone found a way to keep the wheels turning. Whether the 4th chapter of this transformation succeeds remains to be seen. But if history is any guide, betting against Goodyear has never been a winning strategy. Now, here's something fascinating after everything we just covered. Every recession, every crisis, every near bankruptcy, Goodyear kept selling tires. And that is not a coincidence. In fact, there is data that shows the tire industry behaves unlike almost any other sector when the economy tanks. In our next video, we are breaking down exactly why tires are recession-proof and the numbers behind it that almost nobody is talking about.